what we're going to do today, this is the review of the Texas residential lease, and we have two separate classes. One that's just the review of the lease because it's such a long document, has lots of pieces to it. And then we have a separate class that reviews all like the addendums to the lease, which we can do if there's enough of you guys interested, we can do it anytime. Because it's, the animal agreement and the supplemental things, the pool, if there's one, and so we'll start with the lease. Here's where we'll start. So first of all, I will tell you, I mean, this is not like a fun or sexy document or class, but leases do happen. I have been a landlord for a long time and a property manager. When I got my real estate license, because I was an attorney, my dad was like, congratulations, you get to manage all of our commercial properties, which was like, I had no idea how to do it. So I have had baptism by fire 12 years, whatever, 13 years ago, managing commercial. And then I built a residential portfolio for them as well that I've kind of always managed for them. And I went years and years and years ago to a property management 2-day seminar, and it taught me a lot. And so I'm just going to share, we're going to go through the document and share the practicalities of it, and also what you guys need to know, when you're doing it, and how to think about how to actually list one or lease one, and what does the process look like. So I want this to be useful and not like really boring. So if you have specific questions, just interrupt me and be like, hey, at what point do we do this? Or what does this mean? I will start by saying, yeah, the Venmo is CG Partners, Ellen. And hi, Olivia, I'm glad you're here because I think you being like in the thick of this, doing an actual lease right now, will be helpful. So any question you're having right now is one anyone else would have. So speak up. You can be our ambassador. Okay, so first, this is the Texas Realtors. TREC does not have a lease form, but Texas Realtors does. Remember, and TREC is the Consumer Protection Agency where we get our license, and Texas Realtors is our Realtors Association that protects us and prepares documents for us to use in our practice. So, this is the residential lease form. It's from the Texas Realtors. TREC does not have one. And I will tell you, generally speaking, this document protects us, obviously, because our association wrote it for us. It's also a very landlord-friendly document. So just be aware of that when you're representing a tenant. That this document, generally speaking, has a lot of protections for the landlord and is very one-sided toward the landlord. Our TREC contract for the sale of real estate is a very even document, right? That's a consumer protection agency and they want it to be relatively even, but this one protects landlords because most likely if an agent is involved in a transaction, they're representing the landlord and helping them get this leased up. So that's the first place to start. The other place to start is that when you are representing either a tenant or a landlord, you need to advise them, you should read this full lease, because after we have done our part and helped them get into it and execute the transaction, they're still in a relationship for a year. And that we are not property managers. Expressly, we're not property managers, right? There's a whole different ball of wax and insurance and issues and liability that come with that. We just don't need to be doing property management as Briggs Freeman agents. So the landlord and the tenant both need to read the lease and understand what's in it. Does that usually happen? Probably not, but we should definitely be advising them to read it. Obviously, if there's an issue in 3 months, they need to look at the 4 corners of the document and figure it out. Can they still reach out to you and ask? Yes. And if you don't know, call me because I know this document relatively well. But they should read it. They're going to be bound by its terms for at least however long their lease is, right? Any questions before we get going? All right, I want to look at y'all's faces. I'm just dragging things around. Give me a sec. Okay. So here we go. So this is the lease. The current date of the form you should be using is July 22nd. That's when they updated it. And who are the parties? You're going to put the landlord and the tenant. I always say, so let's talk about first just how you get going in a lease and the application process. So if you list a property for lease and you show it and the tenant is interested, the landlord has a few options. And again, you have to explain to your landlord, they can't be totally passive in this. If they're going to be a landlord for a year or however long, they need to understand and they need to be somewhat proactive. Like you can't represent them the whole time throughout the duration of the lease because we're not their property manager. So they have to figure out how do they want to screen the tenants. Briggs Freeman, we recommend My Smart Move because that's a pretty easy to use and intuitive like website where the prospective tenant can log on, pay, and send the application to the landlord. And we want the landlord to review that application, not you guys. Like the last thing you want is to be like, yeah, this tenant looks really good, and then for them to be like a total deadbeat. So we want, just like Ninja teaches us, we manage the process, they manage the decisions. So we can say like you should use my Smart Move, and then when they get the application, they can review it. Um, I also have my tenants fill out, I'm going to share another document with you, the residential lease application, just because it has a lot of good information on it that I just want to have in case they are a total deadbeat. Knock on wood, I've only had one in my like entire property management career, but this is the Texas Realtors residential lease application form. You know, who are they referred? What are the basic terms? Have they viewed the property? Who's social security, driver's license, all of this good information. Who else is going to live in the property? They have to kind of be honest about who's living there. And then then it gives you information. So you could rent a screen on your own. If the landlord's not going to use My Smart Move, they may have some other software. I use one only because I've been using it for a million years called ctcredit.net. To like, I take this information and I put it in and I pay $35 and it checks a few different things for me and it shows me their credit history and stuff like that. So it shows you their income, what kind of cars, do they have dogs, basic stuff. And then on the last page, it gives whoever authorization, the landlord, broker's representative is, it gives them authorization to run the credit check. So that's what that looks like. And the other thing I'm going to share, I'm just getting all of the really exciting stuff out of the way first. We have a document. It's called the tenant selection criteria. And if you go into BF Office, you can just search tenant selection criteria at the top and this document will come up. You can deliver it to this prospective tenant to say, these are the things we're going to look at and review your application on. So it's not like coming out of nowhere, the things you're going to do. So I usually, when I put together my little application packets, I print out an application, this tenant selection criteria, and the IABS, because I always represent the landlord. And if I'm holding like an open house, then I want the tenants to have all of that information and understand, like I always say when I meet them, like, we own this property, or my mom owns this property and I manage it for her. I'm an agent, I represent her, and I make clear, like, I represent the landlord, like you're on your own, buddy, right? Which is the whole point of the IABS, and having that IABS delivered to them is another way of doing it. So this is what this looks like. Any questions about this process right now? Okay, one last thing, and then we'll get to the lease, which I know you guys are just super excited about. Do I use that every time? Do I use what every time? The tenant selection criteria?
Yeah, the tenant selection criteria, which I think is a great idea. Is
I
that
do,
required?
just
Okay.
because I don't want to like take, because I charge an application fee and My Smart Move also will. I make them send me the money because I'm paying ctcredit.net. I use it every time just because I want them to know, like, these are the things that I'm looking at, right? And sometimes, if there's a tenant that's like, just so you know, I went through a divorce and I had an eviction last year, or I have really bad credit because of X, Y, and Z. Like, I generally find that if someone is upfront with you about their situation, that's a good sign. So, but yeah, I try to use it. Like I said, okay, this is a good segue. The way that I get my properties leased. So this is something else you guys should know. When we put a lease listing into MLS, Zillow is super smart and they stopped the syndication. So when you put a lease listing into MLS, it is not automatically getting pushed to Zillow like our sale listings are. If you want your lease listing to be in Zillow, you have to proactively go in there and put it in and pay. I think it changes all the time. I think it's like $30 a month. 1000% I would do that because that's where all the tenants are. And what I usually do is I put it in at the beginning of the week and I say there will be an open house on Sunday from 1 to 2. And that way I'm not doing like a million lease showings. I just have an open house. Now, obviously, if a showing needs to happen and someone really, really can't, and they seem like a good tenant and they communicate well, I'll like make a special showing for them. But my properties aren't close, so I don't like to do that. I just like to do the open house and run everyone through at the same time. Um, so that's how that works. You have to have a Zillow account, go in there and separately input it and make like kind of a Zillow listing as well as your MLS listing. It does not sync and push through. So you have to talk about that with your seller. Like, do you want this to go on Zillow? If you want to charge them an extra, I know leases aren't super, you know, super lucrative. So if you want to charge them, like it's $30 a month for Zillow, like I'm gonna add that onto my commission at the end or whatever. Um, but just so you're aware that that needs to happen. Good? Too much information? How are we doing? Good? Okay, perfect. So now let's go to the actual lease. So fun. And I am going to talk fast. But I think that the meat of how this actually works is actually like a really, really important part of this class. Just because if you don't do it that often, it's hard to know what's the right way to do this. Okay, I'm watching the chat. Um, can you repeat what 4 docs you include? Okay, perfect. Yeah, so I do the residential lease application, the information about brokerage services, and the tenant selection criteria. There's not a fourth one. If there's a fourth one, I lied, my bad. Those 3 things make up a little, what, 6-page packet, 7-page packet? No, yeah, because the IABS and the tenant selection criteria are each 1 page, and then I think the application is I think it's 4 or 5 pages. It's literally right in front of me. Why don't I look? It's 4 pages, so it should be a little 6-page, and then I just staple it together and I have them sitting there. And I leave them in the property so I don't have to like remember them when I go for my little open houses. Okay, so once you get a prospect, typically what happens is if the tenant's gonna fill out an application. It's gonna be screened somehow. If the landlord says, yes, I approve this person, then someone has to draft the lease. It's not like in a sale where the buyer writes the offer. Like typically the landlord knows all the terms they want. So the listing agent or the landlord is gonna write the lease and put in the terms. Because as the tenant, you wouldn't know what the terms are really. So we're just gonna run through them. And again, interrupt me if you have questions. I am watching the chat. Okay, so landlord, tenant, and again, you want anyone who's a tenant, you want to be legally responsible. Like if it's like sometimes I get like a mother-daughter and the daughter's 22, but the mom is the one renting the property. Like I think they should both be on the hook for that. One time I had a daughter with special needs, and so we didn't put her as a tenant, but we put her as a resident. So it's just legally who can you go after if someone defaults. So tenants, you don't need if they have a 6-year-old daughter, like she doesn't need to be listed as like a tenant necessarily. She's going to be a resident, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so address of the property, legal description in whatever, and then whatever, following non-real property items. All of my units have a fridge, some of them have a microwave. I've rented properties before where I like left the TVs installed, and so I put all of that in there. So it says this is coming with the lease, right? Um, and then, the term, when does it start? When does it end? And then this says, the tenant must occupy the property within 5 days. If they're unable to because the landlord doesn't have it ready or the prior tenant is holding over, then the tenant may terminate by giving written notice. Or the landlord will abate rent for the delay. So just so that you're aware of what's in there. Again, your clients, because they're going to be in a year-long relationship governed by this document, like they should read this document. So definitely advise them about that. Okay, so now it says, this lease on its face, it automatically renews. So if they do a month-to-month lease and then they do a lease and then it ends, but they never renew it, it's not like the lease just expires. Like this lease automatically renews itself. Someone has to terminate it. And so that's what this talks about, is giving written notice of termination. And it says time is of the essence, which means you have to comply with the deadlines. And then, this says this lease automatically renews on a month-to-month basis unless someone provides written notice. And they can either provide written notice 30 days before, or, I always put 40 days before the expiration. So I know like, okay, I have a lease ending July 31st. I need to check in with them at the beginning of June if they're going to renew or not, right? Because if they don't renew, if they plan on and they're usually like, oh yeah, we're terminating. Or if I want to say, okay, well, I just rented the unit next door for much more, I do want to raise the rent by $25 or whatever. I generally speaking don't raise the rent a ton if I have like a good tenant who's happy there, because those are a gift. So, but if you do it this way, then you just have to give notice. I check this box and put 45 days before the expiration date. And then I put a note in my calendar like, oh, this lease expires on July 31st. So I need to check in with them by June 15th. That makes sense? Yes. So one point here, and this is kind of a management thing, and it's a tip for your landlords. For a long time, I like collected checks and kept things in a spreadsheet, and it was like my worst nightmare because I'm an organized but also disorganized person. I started using apartments.com, and it's really great because as a landlord, because I can set up, once I get a lease signed, I can go in there and put the start date, the end date, how much money they owe every month, if there's a late fee, how much do I want to collect a security deposit, do I want to collect a tenant, a pet deposit, and then the tenants can actually pay through apartments.com, and it goes directly into my bank account. And the best part about that is that it keeps track if people haven't paid you or don't pay you on time, which I was very, very terrible at. So having it all electronic for me is like a godsend, and there's no charge, which is very weird. But and I've only had one tenant ever who was like, I can't figure this out, or I don't know how to do this. Now it's just awesome. I can log into apartments.com. I can see all my units. I can see who's late. It automatically adds the late fee. There is a communication portal where if something breaks, they can communicate through that. Sometimes a tenant does that. Sometimes a tenant just texts me. So that's my pro tip is I really like apartments.com. That is not a Briggs Freeman tip. That's a Zareen can't keep track of random checks coming in at random dates tip. And it has been a lifesaver for me. So that's a easy thing. Okay, so then this says if the lease renews on a month-to-month basis, it continues to renew on a month-to-month basis until either party provides a written notice of termination. And then the termination is effective when. So you can either say it's going to be effective on the last day of the month following the notice it's given, or it's on the date designated in the notice. So as the landlord, I don't want to mess in the last month, like prorating rent and figuring out how much they owe me. So I check this box one. And even if they say, like, I just had this happen, they're like, well, we're going to be out by mid-April. And I'm like, okay, well, you owe all of April, so stay as long as you want, right? I check B1, and then I know that they're always just going to pay me like the full monthly rent amount. Does that make sense? It just makes it easier from like a management point of view.
So
Questions
quick
there?
question. So
Yeah.
so you don't ever prorate, you just say you owe me for the last month, even if you're gonna be on the 15th, you always do that? Is that
Yeah,
easier? Okay,
and I have the right to do that because I've checked B1. If I
perfect.
had checked B2, the tenant could say, hey, we're terminating on April 14th and we'll send
Yeah,
you 14/30ths of whatever our rent is. And that's annoying for
yeah.
me. So I just say B1 and then they owe me the whole month and then they can move out at their leisure, right? Um, okay. So then, once the monthly rent amount, and then I always say that I want them to pay on the first day of the month. And then, it says the weekends, holidays, meal delays don't exclude their obligation. They'll pay the first month payable to, and then this is where you guys have to decide how to do it. Typically with Briggs Freeman, I think the easiest way to do is have the money between the tenant and the landlord always go between the tenant and the landlord, and then have the Briggs Freeman accounting department invoice the landlord for our commission that we can either keep ourselves or pay to the other broker if there is one involved. So I always just say pay it to the landlord. Um, but you guys have to figure out with the landlord how they want to do it. If the landlord's like, no, just have them cut the first month rent directly to you and that's your commission, you can do it that way too. You just have to talk to your landlord. So the first month's rent is due and payable not later than blank. And how are they going to pay it? Okay, so this is the part where it gets like you have to do a little bit of mental gymnastics and figure out how your landlord wants to do it. The way that I like to do it is I like to collect my security deposit, any pet deposit, and one full first month's rent, even if they're starting their lease on, May 20th, I still want to collect a first full month's rent so that I at least know that this tenant has the ability to pay 1 month's rent for security deposit, 1 month's rent plus. I want to know that they have like some cash and that this isn't challenging and that their first payment like doesn't bounce or whatever. So that's how I do it. So I say if we're executing the lease today, what's today, May 13th, I say by May 20th, you have to have the first full month's rent to me, and I'll set it up in apartments.com and send the request, and then they have to set it up and send the money. And I check electronic payment because I use that. But your landlord may say, oh, I want checks or whatever it is. Okay. Now, if they're moving in on May 20th, obviously for May, they only owe 10 days, right? So then I would say you have prorated rent of, what is it? May has 31 days, 10 over 31 of the rent. So you have, let's say it's $1,000. So a third of that is $333 is due. And then I would make $333 due on June 1st. So does that make sense? I kind of switch the prorated amount and the first full month's rent and do it that way. And you can set that up in apartments.com. It's relatively easy where you just say, I want this much due on this date. I want this much due on this date. And then in apartments.com, I say on July 1st, I want you to start charging the full month's rent through the end of the term. And it's a little bit of mental gymnastics to think about, but once you really think about it, it makes sense. So any questions there? Are we getting too like nitty gritty? What's up, Olivia?
Okay, quick question. This is probably really obvious and a really dumb question, but like,
No dumb question.
I'm confused about, okay, so you're setting this stuff up on apartments.com.
Mhm.
So you're monitoring the tenant paying the landlord? Is that what you're doing?
Well, no, that's a great point. When I say I mean Zareen the landlord, not Zareen the realtor.
Oh, okay.
So you don't have to tell the landlord they have to use apartments.com. They may want to do it however they want, but you can say like, I know a landlord who uses this and it's very easy. If you're interested, you should look into it. The
Awesome.
website is apartments.com, right? You do not need to go in there and set up. I know we all like to be full service and do everything for our clients, but in a lease situation, because this relationship is going to extend between the tenant and the landlord well past the time that you're involved, you should not be setting up apartments.com for them.
Okay, great.
You can do the Zillow listing if you want, because that's going to be like communicating with clients and stuff like that. The landlord may want to do that, right? But I would not do anything. We don't really need to be getting in the middle of like money. That's why I do like My Smart Move, because the tenant is paying My Smart Move directly for their background check versus you taking a check and running a screen, or it just gets a little bit complicated.
Yeah, totally.
That's a great question. So if I do that again and I'm confusing because I say and you don't know if you mean I the landlord or I the property manager, like ask me to clarify. It's a good question. So Melissa's asking, just to be clear, I collect pet deposit, security deposit, and first month's rent with any prorated amount. So no, what I do is I collect 2 full months rent plus a pet deposit. And one of those months rent is security deposit. One of those months rent is the full first month's rent. And then I don't collect prorated rent until the first day of the first full month. So in my example, right, if Marty and I sign a lease today that starts on May 20th, I'm gonna ask Marty to send me a full month's rent for security deposit, full month's rent to cover the first full month, plus any pet deposit. And then on June 1st, I'm gonna ask Marty to pay only the prorated amount that would cover May, the 10 days in May or 11 days in May, whatever, that she was in the unit. Hopefully that helps. Good question.
So does that mean, okay, if I'm doing that in May, you're doing for 1 month's rent for security, and then the next month for the full month rent, would that be the July?
Yeah, so the way that the payments will
And-
look, I know
okay,
this is always tricky. Right now, I'm gonna collect 1,000 for security deposit, 1,000 for the first full month's rent, and 350 for my pet deposit right now.
okay,
And then on the next time they'll owe money, before I even will give them the keys, I need that money. And then I'll give them the keys on May 20. And then on June 1st, I'm gonna collect $333. That's prorated May rent.
okay.
And then on July 1st, I'm gonna collect $1,000, that's the month I'm gonna start collecting a full month's rent through the end of the
Right.
week. Does
Makes sense.
that answer your question? Okay, cool. Okay. So, and then, how are we gonna pay all of this? I only click electronic payment because I just don't want to mess with checks. I'm really bad about that. Okay. And when the landlord, not I, the realtor. Okay, so place of payment. So this is where you say, like, where are they gonna pay it? Are they mailing it in? I just put like via apartments.com is what I type in here. So now, method of payment, tenant must pay all rent timely and without demand, deduction, or offset, except as permitted by law or this lease. So they have to pay the full amount. Time is of the essence for the payment of rent. And you guys know that time is of the essence is like a legal term of art that means you must strictly adhere to deadlines, right? If there's a provision in our contract that isn't is of the essence, which in our sale contract, most of them aren't, it means there's some wiggle room. So in our sale contract, the option and the delivery of earnest money, like time is of the essence in that paragraph, our closing date is actually not time is of the essence. So if someone misses it by a day or two because their lender's a little slow or whatever reason, that is actually not an of the essence date. There is a little bit of wiggle room there. That's what that means. Good? Okay, cool. Okay, so unless the parties agree otherwise, tenant may not pay and they will pay rent through this manner. And then landlord does or does not require tenants to pay monthly rents by one payment. So if I used to, my little Mary Mac house, I used to rent to these two guys, and I said I require that they pay it in one rent because I don't want to just get half the rent. And then they're like, I would say just send me one payment. Did they do that? No, but the lease did say you're supposed to pay me all in one payment and you guys figure it out yourself. Now with apartments.com, like they actually can set it up where they're each paying however much they want to. And it doesn't make any difference to me. It just shows up in my bank account. So if tenant fails to timely pay any amounts due under this lease, or if any check is not honored, landlord may require tenant to pay such amount any subsequent amount in certified funds. This paragraph does not limit landlord from seeking other remedies. So very landlord friendly paragraph, right? Okay. And then rent increases. There will be no rent increases through the primary term, but landlord may increase the rent that will be paid during any month renewal period by providing at least 30 days written to notice. So this sentence overrides what I said earlier about the 45 days. That's just if we're going to renew or not. But I could do it technically within 30 days written notice of the end of the lease. Good. Okay. Okay, so late charge. So if landlord does not actually receive by this has to be at least the third day under Texas law. So I usually put the fifth day, and then apartments.com, I say on the sixth day, charge this much. I'm being like super generous just because as a landlord, I always want to be like on the right side of whatever the law is and like be a nice landlord, which is probably dumb, but whatever. I put 5 here, but technically I think it has to be at least 3. And then so an initial late charge of what? I mean, I charge $50. You may want to change it depending on the amount. And then this says additional late charges of blank per day. So if they continue to be late, apartments.com does not have a way of adding additional late charges, but your landlord may want to just put this in there and then keep track of it. And you can go in and manually add a charge if you want to. Okay, so the property code prohibits assessing a late fee until rent has remained unpaid for at least 2 full days off after the date on which is due. So I think that's what I do. I think I put 3 here, and then on the 6th day is when I actually charge the late fee because of this property code paragraph. I will say something that you guys need to understand and your landlords need to understand is that there is a lot of law and a lot of statutes in the property code about landlord tenant issues. And so someone who's like embarking on this adventure of being a landlord like needs to understand they're going to have to educate themselves and be well versed, and they can't just rely on you to know it all. There's just too much liability and responsibility in being a landlord, and once the lease is executed, you guys are not the property managers anymore, and it's on them. Okay, can I say that enough times? So for the purpose of paying rent and any late charges, the mailbox is not the agent for receipt for landlord. Meaning the postmark date is not the date that the landlord receives payments. There is a rule in the law called the mailbox rule, which means if you put your stuff in the mail and it gets postmarked, that's the date of the postmark is the legal date of delivery, even if the recipient doesn't actually receive it until 3 days later. That's just a weird legal thing. And this is saying the mailbox rule does not apply. The landlord has to have the rent. So the parties agree that the late charge is reasonable based on uncertain damages to the landlord. So we're stipulating here that the tenant can't say like that was unreasonable. We're like agreeing in writing that the late fee we agreed on is reasonable. Okay, is this big enough? Can you guys see it? Okay, now that we're like halfway through the class, good job. Okay, so tenant will pay the landlord this much for each payment that tenant tenders to landlord, which is not returned. So this is a late fee. So I put $75. Again, your landlord, when your landlord could fill out all of this, should advise you. If they're looking for direction, that's why I'm giving you guys numbers. These are just numbers I made up. Your landlord may have strong opinions and we manage the process, they manage the decisions. I'm just giving you insight onto like what I put. It could probably be more. Like I said, I'm kind of a sucker of a landlord. Okay, application of funds. This is important. It's underlined. Regardless of any notation on a payment, landlord may apply funds received from tenant first to any non-rent obligations of tenant, including but not limited to late charges, return payment, repairs, brokerage fees, periodic utilities, animal charges, and then to rent. So if the tenant is has an animal on the property, like without complying with the terms of this lease and that they owe a $350 fee and they send in their typical monthly rent, the landlord can say, I'm applying the first $350 of that rent to this animal charge that they owe me. And now they're behind on their rent, even if they actually paid their rent on time. Does that make sense? This is something the landlord needs to understand. Okay, so animals. So unless the parties otherwise agree in writing, tenant may not permit even temporary any animal on the property. And then it describes all the animals, including any animal. An assistance animal is not considered a pet, but is still required to be reported to the landlord with accompanying documentation as required by the Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs. We're not going to get into like the nuances of animal agreement. I will send you in my follow-up email, like the Texas Workforce Commission weirdly governs like assistance animals. And so I'll send you, they have a little packet explaining, and then there's like a really good website that kind of asks the questions. I know if you get in this situation, I know the law pretty well about what this is. This just happened to me with a unit that I rented where the guy was like, oh, I have a dog. Oh, but he's an assistance animal. And I was like, great, like send me your paperwork because this guy doesn't have any like visible disability. So I'm allowed to ask for paperwork that says like I just need paperwork that says that this is an assistance animal and this is like the nature of what they do. I'll send it to you. We're not going to get into like the nuances of it, but it's helpful to have and it's helpful to share with your landlords, and then they can decide how to follow it or not. For the record, he said he would send it to me. He never did. So it was just baloney. He just didn't want to pay the pet deposit. So that already started off on the wrong foot. Okay, so there is an accompanying document that Texas Realtors have. It's called Animal Agreement. It used to be called Pet Agreement. Even if it is an assistance animal, they still have to fill it out and tell you like this animal has had their shots, like blah, 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 blah. And just so you have a record of what's the animal on the property. You as a landlord, just the landlord is not required to charge a pet deposit for an assistance animal, or you're not allowed to charge additional rent, even if you would be charging that if they were a pet. Does that make sense? Because an assistance animal is not considered a pet. But again, I'll send you the paperwork so you have it, and then just call me if you get questions about it. We get questions about this all the time. So if tenant violates paragraph 9 and keeps an animal on the property, landlord can take all of the following action. This is where this becomes a very landlord-friendly document. They can immediately declare tenant in default, charge the tenant an additional rent in the amount of this, remove or cause to be removed any unauthorized animal and deliver it to appropriate local authorities by providing at least 24-hour written notice to tenant of their intention to do so, and then charge the tenant the landlord's cost to do any of these things: remove the animal, exterminate the property, clean and deodorize it, repair any damage. So that's a pretty like, you can go take their dog if they don't tell you that they have a dog on the property with proper notice. So are we going to do that? No, but just so that your tenant understands too, like, hey, this is pretty severe. Like if you're going to get an animal and you don't have one now, like let your landlord know. Okay, and then when taking any action under this paragraph, landlord will not be liable for any harm, injury, death, or sickness to any animal. So tenant beware. Okay, so security deposit. On or before the execution of this lease, tenant will pay a security deposit in the amount of this through this method. The security deposit, is defined in the property code. Any additional deposits like a pet deposit that get paid become part of the security deposit. And then this says no interest is paid on the security deposit, but landlord can place it in an interest-bearing account, and that becomes the landlord's interest. And then this is important for landlords to know. Tenant must give landlord at least 30 days written notice of surrender before landlord is obligated to account for refund of the security deposit. And any refund of the security deposit will be made to all tenants named in this lease. And then the property code, and this is bold and conspicuous, you can see they made it bold. The property code does not obligate a landlord to return or account for the security deposit until the tenant surrenders the property and gives the landlord a written statement of the tenant's forwarding address. after which landlord has 30 days in which to account. So that's the way that works. You need to let your tenants know that when they move out, they need to let the tenant know like, hey, I've moved out of the property on this date, and this is my forwarding address for the return of my security deposit. I mean, mine's electronic now, so they don't need to give me an address, but they have to kind of say like, my lease is over. I want my security deposits back. Here's where to send it. Right? That's in the lease. Okay. But just to read this too, the property code provides that a tenant may not withhold payment of any portion of the last month rent on the grounds that security deposit is security. So I had one super slippery tenant, and he tried to say, well, I'm not sending you my last month's rent because you took my security deposit. And I expressly pointed out to him like, nope, that's not what this is for. And then I pointed out the next provision. Bad faith violations of this may subject a tenant to liability up to 3 times the rent wrongfully withheld and our attorney's fees. So once you point that out to people, they're like, okay, fine. And they send you the last month's rent, and then you still have the security deposit to use what the security deposit is for. Good? Okay. All right. So then this is deductions. Landlord may deduct reasonable charges from the security deposit for, damages excluding normal wear and tear, all reasonable costs that tenant is responsible. I usually put into my leases that the tenant needs to pay for professional cleaning and provide a receipt, so that I'm obviously going to have every unit professionally cleaned in between tenants. So that if they don't provide me a receipt, which 50% of the time they either don't have it cleaned or they don't provide me the receipt, I can take the cost of my cleaning out of their security deposit. Unpaid rent, accelerated rent, late charges, unpaid utilities fees, unpaid pet charges, replacing unreturned keys, garage door openers, the removal of unauthorized locks, landlord's cost to access the property if made inaccessible by tenants. So I always tell the tenant, this is what you need to leave the property. And if they don't, and I have to like call a locksmith or something, I can deduct that from the security deposit. Packing, removing, there's a ton of things in here. Packing, removing, and storing property, removing vehicles, the cost of reletting if tenant is in default, attorney's fees, cost of court, mailing costs with sending notices, other unpaid charges, damages to the property. Where do I add that clause about the cleaning? You can put it in special provisions. I actually have like a whole separate addendum that I use that outlines a few different things, but I would just write it into special provisions, and I can send you some language if you want. Let me make a note of that. Just send me the cleaning language and the pet stuff. Okay. Okay, so if deductions exceed the security deposit, tenant will pay to landlord the excess within 10 days after landlord makes written demand. Good luck, but you do have the right to try. Okay, utilities. So tenant will pay all connections, fees, service fees, usage fees, and all other costs for all utilities except the following which landlord will pay. So usually, the tenant's paying for everything. But if sometimes people put HOA dues if they want to make clear that the landlord pays the HOA dues and the tenant pays everything else. So generally speaking, the tenant is responsible for getting all of those things connected. Questions there? Unless provided by landlord, tenant must at a minimum keep the following utilities on: gas, electric, water, wastewater, garbage. Before signing this lease, tenants should determine if all necessary utilities are available to the property and are adequate for tenants' use. I'll just take a moment here. Well, we're going to talk about it later too, to say, as a general rule, like I think it's super important for tenants to see the space before they rent it. The 2 times that I've let a tenant rent one of my property site unseen, it was kind of a mess. So that's now my requirement. I just say like, I don't rent the property to people that have not been able to visit the property, because you just want them to know what to expect. But this is like, if they're like, oh, the internet is too slow or whatever, it doesn't matter. Like, not our problem. That's what this says. Okay, so occupants. So this is where they list everyone who's going to live there, like the little kids, etc., that aren't like actual tenants. And then if any contact information changes, they must change it. Is or is not the property part of the HOA? Tenants must comply with the rules. We used to own a unit in the tower in Fort Worth. And this is one thing you need to be aware of. If you are renting a property that's in a HOA, you got to make sure that they allow rentals. B, you got to make sure that they might have rules around the rentals. Like at the tower, tenants are treated differently than owners. Like tenants can't have dogs. The HOA had to review and approve every lease. It had to be for at least a year, et cetera, et cetera. There were all these different rules. They had their own like supplemental HOA attachment that became part of the lease. So if you're leasing a property that's in an HOA, you need to find out like what are their rules around rentals. So there you go. That's what this says. Okay, so prohibitions. Unless otherwise authorized by this lease, tenant may not install or permit you. Your landlord just needs to know that this is in here. Spa, hot tub, pool, trampoline, any item which causes a suspension or cancellation of insurance or an increase in permits. They cannot permit any part of the property to be used for any activity which is a nuisance, offensive, noisy, or dangerous. Vehicle repair. You don't want to like rent a house and then pull up and see that there are like 4 cars with like their trunks open in the front. The neighbors will really love you. Any business of any type, including not limited childcare, any activity which violates the zoning, owners association restrictive covenants, anything illegal, including but not limited to the growth of cannabis, or any activity that obstructs, interferes, or infringes on the rights. This was an addition in 2022, this last sentence. Tenant may not list any part of the property on any lodging or short-term rental website or with any service or with any person or service that advertises property for rent. So what we were finding, especially with some of our luxury properties, is that someone would rent our, $12,000 a month like high-rise unit and then be putting it on Airbnb, which they could not do. So now the lease expressly prohibits them from doing that, right? Does that make sense? Okay. That was new and a good addition. So guests, tenants may or may not permit any guests to stay on the property longer than any amount of time. I usually put 7 days. And then it says no guests are permitted to stay on the property more than twice the number of days in the space above in any 30-day period. So you can't have like a permanent guest is what this is basically saying. And then landlord is not obligated to pay any non-mandatory or user fees for tenants' use of any common area facilities. So some developments have like a common pool, but you have to pay extra to use it. Landlord doesn't have to pay for that. Okay, so then how many vehicles can they park? And then what are the rules around parking those vehicles? You can't store vehicles, you can't landlord can have it towed if there's an unoperative vehicle sitting on the property, if it's parked in violation, et cetera, et cetera. Tenant must promptly inform landlord of any changes in tenant's vehicle information. Okay. I'm sorry, I thought we had a question. Questions about this? Again, I know this is super exciting, but it's just important to know that this is in here. Okay, access by landlord. This is an important part. This is actually one of the few spaces when we do represent tenants where if they bother to read the lease, which yay for them, they might push back a little bit. So this is important for us to know, just as agents in general. So landlord may prominently display a for sale or for lease sign during the term of this lease or any renewal period. Landlord or landlord's contractor may take interior, exterior photographs or images of the property and use the photographs or images in any advertisements to lease or sell the property. So that's important. You can call the tenant and say, hey, we're taking photographs tomorrow with all of your stuff in it and put them on the internet. So your tenants need to know that. Like I said, this is very landlord friendly. We had a tenant, we've had a couple tenants push back on this before. And so we kind of because I'm an attorney, or Angela, marked it up and edited it and sent it back to the landlord for review. We said, look, we really don't want you taking photos when our stuff is in there, whatever. So that's a negotiation, but your tenants need to know that that's in there. Okay, good questions. Okay, access. So this is important for you guys to know too. Before accessing the property, landlord or anyone authorized by landlord will attempt to first contact the tenant, but may enter the property at reasonable times without notice to make repairs or to show the property to prospective tenants, prospective buyers, inspectors, fire marshals, lenders, blah, blah, blah. Additionally, landlord or anyone authorized landlord may peacefully enter the property at reasonable times without first attempting to contact the tenant and without notice to survey or review the condition, take photographs, make emergency repairs, exercise a lien, leave written notices, like if you're evicting them, and seize non-exempt property. So that's a pretty broad ability for the landlord to access the property without notice, right? Like this says landlord may enter the property at reasonable times without notice to show the property. That's pretty wild. So just be aware that that's in there. I know that most tenants don't read this lease because I feel like most people would probably object to that. So trip card. Yeah. What's up?
It goes back to like the water bills and utilities and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
My landlord was asking if she can require that the tenants like basically not be stingy on their water bill because she wants her landscaping to stay a certain quality. Is that
So later in the lease, there's a section that governs how often if the tenant is in charge of maintenance, it governs how often they should water like the foundation and the yard. So I would put that there.
Interesting.
So we'll get there, and then you need to point that out to your landlord and see if that's sufficient for them. If it's not, we can come up with something. I don't think we can say like your water bill at minimum needs to be X, but we can say like you have to agree to water the lawn for at least 15 minutes 3 times a week or whatever.
Okay.
And we'll get there. It's a great question. Okay, so trip charges, if landlords or landlord agents have made arrangements and then they can't access, they can charge a trip charge of this much, because there are rules about keyless deadbolt. So if the tenant locks the keyless deadbolt, you can't get in from the outside, and that's like a safety thing. That's part of the law. But if they lock the keyless deadbolt and you have an appointment to get in there and you can't, you're kind of screwed, and you can charge them a trip charge. Okay,
Doreen, I
yeah,
have a question going back to access
yeah.
and the access basically. Because I recently did a lease, and my tenant client was not real thrilled with this paragraph. Because in essence, they can enter the property anytime, really, right?
Yes, yeah, if they're like, oh, they could bring anyone with them and be like, I'm showing them the property. It's like, yeah, in theory, yes. So yes, if you are in a situation where you want to push back on that, just reach out to me and we can figure out some reasonable language to like say, hey, and I would draft a different paragraph and we would cross through this into special provisions, right? What this is kind of how we did it. Is that your question?
That was my question. Good. I was
Yeah.
just wondering if there's a workaround for that.
There's always a workaround, right? Like this is the landlord and tenant are private parties and they could contract however they want to, and it's our job to facilitate that. But since you guys are not attorneys, like you shouldn't write stuff. We did have an agent last year who got in trouble with Trek for practicing law without a license, and we don't want that. It was not like the end of the world and was basically a slap on the hand, but we don't want anyone to get in trouble. And because you guys have 2 attorneys like at your disposal, like if you ever want to draft something or change the terms, please call us. I was helping an agent when I was out of town on like a $3 million deal where they had written in this crazy provision. And I was like, please don't write in provisions anymore, please. So don't do that. Okay.
Okay.
Ever.
Thank you.
Yeah. So okay, let me find my little cursor. So where were we? Key box. Okay, so a key box is a locked container placed on the property, holding a key to the property. It's opened by a special combination. The key box is a convenience, but it involves risk. You'll notice this is in bold because they want people to read it. Neither the Association of Realtors nor the MLS requires the use of a key box. So now it's saying tenant authorizes landlord or landlord's property manager to place a key box on the property during the last blank days of this lease, or at any time the landlord lists the property for sale with a licensed Texas broker. So if I decided I'm going to sell my units right now, even if I just signed a lease that starts May 20th, I could leave a key box on the property because I'm going to have showings to buyers, right? So, and I could sell it. If I do sell it, that doesn't mean that the tenant gets kicked out. It just means that the buyer is going to buy the property with that lease in place. So the buyer will become the new landlord. Okay. It's not when you transfer property that the leases end. The buyer just buys the property subject to that lease, which you guys know when you write contracts, there's that paragraph 4 where you have to say, I think it's 4, that you have to say like, are there leases on this property? Okay. So I usually put the last 45 days of this lease, but I also have like digital combos now on all of my leases because I'm also, in addition to not being good at keeping track of checks, I'm not good at keeping track of keys. So I had my little handyman put keypads on all of them. So now I have the same code and I can get in anytime, which is very nice. Okay, so tenant may withdraw tenant's authorization to place a key box by providing written notice and paying landlord fee of blank. Well, if I want to have a key box the last 30 days of the listing or 45 and they say no, then I'm going to charge them a full month's rent because they're costing me that month of being able to mark the property. So I usually put a full month's rent here. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I put. No one's ever done it. Honestly, when I transition my properties, because they rent pretty fast, I just let the tenant move out and then I assess and I put it on the market because I don't like showing, I think properties look gross when there's tenants stuff in them, especially when that tenant's about to move out. So I just wait until they move out. The other thing that I do, which is this is Doreen advice, not Briggs Freeman advice, is I have really nice pictures taken of my units once, and then I just reuse those pictures. I don't know if the photographers would love that, but I don't go get new photographs taken every time when it's the same unit that's leasing year after year. I actually just got some digitally staged and they look awesome. So, okay. If landlord or agents are denied or not able to access, the trip charge, and then this is underlined, so it's important. The landlord, the property and manager, and the landlord's broker are not responsible to tenant's guests, blah, 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 for any damages, injuries, or losses arising from the use of the key box unless caused by landlord, the property manager, or landlord's broker. Okay, so here's the sight unseen notice. And this is helpful, but I still won't do it. Let rent to someone who hasn't seen it. Tenant is given the opportunity to inspect. A tenant who declines to do so and chooses to sign the lease does at their own risk. It's as is, and landlord is under no obligation to make any changes upon tenant viewing the property. Tenant is still bound. So now this is landlord makes no express or implied warranties as to the property's condition. Tenant has inspected the property, accepts it as is, provided that landlord blank. And sometimes I'll be like, oh, I'm going to have it mowed before you move in, or I'm gonna have it cleaned one more time before you move in. So that's where you would write anything like that. I had some tenants one time that were like, this fence is kind of falling over in the back. Like, will you please fix that before we move in? So you'll write in stuff like that there. Okay, and then there's such a thing, Texas Realtors has an inventory and condition form. You can give it to the tenant and they can fill it out within 5 days. And it basically documents like this was the condition of the property. Like when you rented it to me, there was a huge hole in the sheetrock behind this door. So when I move out, don't charge me to repair that sheetrock because it was already there, right? I mean, obviously I'm not going to rent a property with holes in the sheetrock, but it gives this tile in the bathroom is cracked already. It's not my fault, right? It gives the tenant the opportunity to go through 80% of the time when you rent to someone, they do not fill this out or give it back to you, but you can give them the form and then it's their way of saying like, these are the issues with the property, right? And there's also a property manager's version of that, but again, we're not property managers, but you could give it to the landlord if they wanted to fill it out. I don't use that, but I'm probably pretty casual about charging people for repair of things and what have you. The inventory and condition form is not a request for repairs. Tenant must direct all requests for repairs in compliance with paragraph 18. Good to know. Okay, move out. How are we doing? We have 6 minutes to do half of the lease. Move out condition. When this lease ends, tenant will surrender the property in the same condition as when received. Normal wear and tear accepted. They cannot abandon. So what is normal wear and tear? That just means like deterioration over time. Surrender is when they have vacated and it's either the date or the tenant returns the keys, or abandon just means when they vacated. Or the tenant is in lease and landlord has delivered written notice to tenant. So if the tenant just disappears and like skips out on your lease, all of these things have to happen in order for it to be considered abandoned and then for the landlord to kind of move on. So this is just so you guys know this is in there. So if the tenant leaves any personal property in the property, then the landlord has the right to dispose of it, give it away, sell it, and tenant has to reimburse landlord's cost for doing that. So if they leave, they can't be like, oh, hey, I left that sofa there and I was gonna come get it. It's like, sorry, buddy, like check out this paragraph. Okay, so general responsibilities, keep it clean and sanitary, dispose of garbage, change in heating and air conditioning filters, replace all light bulbs, etc. Eliminate dangerous conditions, take necessary precautions to prevent broken water pipes. I always remind my tenants if we're gonna face a big freeze, and I do leave one of those little faucet covers like in the unit because I don't. Sometimes you have like an awesome tenant that would go and do that and be proactive. A lot of times not. So you make it super easy and be like, hey, there's a hose bib cover in your garage. Like, please make sure it's placed where it needs to be, et cetera, et cetera. All of these things. Pay for extermination. That same sneaky tenant that tried to have his security deposit cover his last month's rent told me that he had ants and I was like, oh, I'm sorry about that. Like check out paragraph, I think it's, what are we, 17.9, right? They need to pay for that. Remove standing water, know the location of the water cutoff valve, blah, blah, blah. Okay, yard maintenance. Olivia, here you go. Yard means all lawn, shrubbery, bushes, blah, blah, blah. Maintain the yards means to perform activities such as mowing, fertilizing, controlling pests and weeds, removing debris. Unless prohibited by ordinance or other law, tenant will water the yard at reasonable appropriate times, including but not limited to the following times. So Olivia, this is where you would write in,
What page is this? So
this is page 9,
okay.
paragraph 17B, yard maintenance. And then you say this is landlord at landlord's expense will maintain the yard, tenant will, or if you're like, we have a landscaper and it's $50 a month and you will be responsible for continuing to pay that landscaper. Right? So that's another way that they could do it is they could just, well, I guess when it comes to watering, like you do have to require when they're going to do that. Okay, there's this pool and spa addendum. Prohibitions: if tenant installs any fixtures on the property, they become the property of the landlord. Sometimes people want to install a Ring camera, so you guys have to decide how you're going to want to do that, but technically that becomes the property of the landlord. Tenant may not remove any of it, change any locks, make holes other than like nails for hanging pictures, permit water furniture, install additional outlets, remove or replace paint, wallpapers, change fixtures, hazardous materials, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So these are all the things a tenant can't do. Like I said, very landlord friendly. If tenant fails to comply, landlord can exercise their remedies, do what they're supposed to do, and then charge the tenant. You know, smoking is or is not permitted. Okay, repair requests. Sorry, I'm trying to get to the important stuff. And if you have to drop off at 10, that's totally fine. Again, if you're here for CE credit, put your name and license number into the chat, and you can drop off whenever. I'm gonna just keep breezing through the rest of this, but I'll be quick-ish. Okay, so repair requests, this is the number to call for repair requests. So then this note, your tenants, both and landlords need to read this. If landlord fails to repair a condition that materially affects the physical health or safety of an ordinary tenant, tenant may be entitled to exercise remedies under the property code. If they follow procedures under those sections, then the following remedies may be available to tenant: terminate the lease, attain a refund, have it repaired, or deduct from the cost of rent. But they're not allowed to just do that. Do not exercise these remedies without consulting an attorney. The landlord tenant law is so complicated, so don't have your tenant just say, well, the air conditioning broke and I'm gonna have it fixed and I'm gonna deduct it from the rent. Like, they can't do that. Then this is important. The property code presumes that 7 days is in a reasonable period of time for the landlord to make a diligent effort to repair a condition, unless there are circumstances which establish that a different period of time is appropriate, such as the severity and nature of the condition and the availability of materials. Failure to strictly follow the procedures in the applicable sections may cause tenant to be in default. So there's lots of rules about what you can and can't do. And just 7 days is how much time. And I remember I was like on my way out of town once, and I was like in the trolley in San Francisco on the way to get the rental car, and the tenant called, and it was like Friday at like 6, and they're like, the air conditioning is out. And it was like, ugh. So I could have waited, but I didn't wait. We got it fixed over the weekend, but 7 days is a reasonable period of time, just so you know. So tenant may or may not repair or cause to be repaired any condition without landlord's permission. And then landlord is not obligated to complete a repair on a day other than a business day unless required to do so by the property code. So again, very landlord friendly. So then payment of repair costs, except as otherwise specified, landlord will pay to repair remedy conditions in need of repair if tenant complies with the procedures. This includes but not limited to repairs to the following items not caused by tenants. So they have to repair this. And then landlord will not pay to repair the following items unless the landlord causes it. Conditions caused by tenants, windows and screens. I had a tenant once that was like, can you replace all the screens? And I was like, no, because they were fine. I don't know what she was doing. So damage from windows or doors, damage from water stoppages. Like if the tenant's flushing something down the toilet and it backs up, like that's on the tenant to repair. Items that are cosmetic in nature or falling specific to. So remember I told you that time I rented it with the TVs? I put televisions here because if the television just happened to be hanging, but if the $2,000 television stopped working, I was not going to like replace the television for them. I would have just pulled it down and like patched it up, right? So I put TVs here. I was not going to replace TVs. Trip charges, advance payments. Landlord may require advance payment of repairs or payments for which tenant is responsible. So the tenant may be like, oh, your daughter flushed your doll down the toilet, now it's backed up. Like, I will send the plumber, but I need you to send me the $150 trip charge before I schedule the plumber. Does that make sense? Okay, security devices. This is the last big thing. There's all sorts of laws, and the laws change about what landlords are required to do safety-wise. But all Texas rentals have to have a keyless deadbolt. You have to have a peephole if it's a door that's from the inside of the house, outside of the house, even if it's into the garage, which is idiotic. Sliding doors have to have certain things. There's all these different rules. So I use a company called Rekey, Texas Rekey, Mr. Rekey, but it's called Rekey. And they will come and make sure that your property is up to date and compliant with the code, which I think is awesome. They will supply a fire extinguisher if you need one. They will also replace all the smoke detectors and make sure they're working and they're where they need to be because they're like location requirements. So I think it's well worth the price to hire a third party who is familiar with the state of the law today to do those things for me when my units switch over, right? Because then if there ever is an issue, I can say, well, I was responsible landlord and I hired a company that does this full time to do this for me. There's no liability here, right? So I'll share that with you guys too. It's Texas rekey, and they'll obviously like rekey the locks in between tenants too. So that's awesome. Okay, so all notices required by tenants. You know, they can't install this. They need permission, et cetera, et cetera. Smoke alarm, same things. Okay, liability. Unless caused by landlord, landlord is not responsible to tenant, tenant's guest for any of these things, right? Flood, fire, hail, wind, you know, interruption of utilities, theft, burglary, vandalism. Same guy, my same little last month's rent, exterminator guy he told me his catalytic converter got stolen out of his Tesla. And then I mentioned that to someone and they were like, Teslas don't even have a catalytic converter. And I was like, please check out paragraph 21, right? Like, sorry, not my problem. Tenant will promptly reimburse landlord for any damages caused by the tenant or tenant's guests, including cost of repairs. So that's very one-sided provision, right? Holdover, if tenant fails to vacate, tenant will pay landlord rent for the holdover period. And indemnify landlord and tenants for damages, including but not limited to lost rent, blah, 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 blah. Rent for any holdover period will be 3 times the monthly rent calculated on a daily basis and will be immediately due and payable. So you got to get moved out on time. And then this is a provision. This is probably above our pay grade. But if you ever get in like a super sideways situation with a tenant, the landlord has a lien for unpaid rent against all of tenant's non-exempt personal property that's inside the property and can seize the property. Obviously, if a landlord that you know is in that situation, they should be talking to an attorney about how to do this. So, okay, subordination. This just means that the lease is subject and is subordinate to any mortgage on the property. Like all of our mortgage companies want us to have that in there. Casualty loss. The property code governs the rights and obligations of the parties regarding to casualty loss. That means if it catches on fire. Again, like as a landlord, you're going to have insurance on the structure. Tenants need to have their own renter's insurance for their contents, right? This is where I would add that provision about the cleaning. And then default. This is where you can see how one-sided this lease is. If landlord fails to comply with this lease, tenant may seek any relief provided by law. Good luck. You know, if tenant fails to timely pay all amounts or otherwise fail to comply, tenant's in default and landlord can do all of these things, right? So it's very clearly spelled out. Then what else we got? Okay, early termination. If a tenant wants to early terminate the lease, their best bet is to just ask for help from the landlord and ask the landlord to be willing to comply. There are very, very narrow exceptions under which a tenant legally has the right to terminate early. So you usually just have to work with the landlord. If the tenant wants to move out early, the landlord does have the duty to relet. But again, they can charge the tenant the reletting fees. And that's what this basically says here. And I always put 1 full month's here, full month's rent here and full month's rent here to cover the cost of additional rent. And then you still have the security deposit to deduct for repairs. Okay, representations. Notice this is one-sided representations. The landlord's making no representations, tenants making all of them. Okay, and then this is where you check. I always check residential lease app. The way you get paid is you fill out an agreement between brokers, landlord and property. You do not want your information in here. You just want the tenants and the landlord's contact. And that is pretty much it. This protects us. The brokers to this lease have no knowledge of whether landlord is delinquent in the payment. So if your tenant rents the property and then they find out the landlord is in foreclosure, like we have no obligation there, et cetera, et cetera. The tenant needs to fill this out in case they die, like who should the landlord contact? That's pretty much it. This is where we will not act as the property manager. And then, this lease is negotiable between the parties. It's binding, read it carefully. That's how that looks. So that was the quick and dirty. If you have questions, does anyone have questions real quick? Does the lease cover required? Yes, it's in here. It's on the application. The tenant says that they will. And then if you click this residential lease application, that becomes part of this. But it does say here, there's a part about insurance, and I probably glossed over it in my rush because I talked too much at the beginning. It's one of the boilerplate terms. Let me find it. Oh. Oops. Oh, keyboard's not working. Okay, well, it's not, it's in here, but, it's also in the application. It doesn't, I don't think it requires, I think it recommends. I'll find it. And put that, it's a good question. Okay, what else we got? So the only addenda you include is the residential lease app. I mean, we're supposed to include this rental, the flood disclosure in every lease now. If it's the same rules for lead-based paint. Inventory and condition form, animal agreement. If there's guarantors, you might fill this out. What a guarantor does, it gives the guarantor the same financial obligations on the lease without actually making them a tenant. But there's a form for that. So if you have that agreement between brokers is how you're going to get paid. So if you're on the representing the tenant side, you want to fill that out and send it to the listing broker. Like I said, when we owned a unit of the tower, they had owners and rules. So you click whatever is kind of relevant to you. Okay, sorry guys to run over. Hopefully that was helpful. It's a lot of information, but I wanted you to understand like the mechanics of how this works. Olivia, if you and your landlord have more questions, just give me a call. And that's all I got. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Doreen.
Bye.